Have you seen the recent video that was posted showing the police officer shooting at the guy with a hatchet? Questions you may have. Is a hatchet treated the same as a gun? Was that a good shoot? As is usually the case with officer-involved shootings, it all depends on the facts. And I'd love to be able to tell you some bright line rules about what police officers can do and what they cannot do. But when it comes to police shooting cases, really we're dealing with a self-defense analysis, which is highly fact-dependent. Is a hatchet treated differently than a gun? Yes, but it's complicated. So let's take a look at the facts. This happened on April 21st, 2022 in Jacksonville, Florida. Police had responded to a wooded neighborhood to a report of a man allegedly cutting power to houses, among other things. And actually I'd really like to know what those other things are. Facts matter. The information provided to responding police officers, whether or not they actually end up being true, are crucial facts. The courts will allow officers to rely on what they're told when analyzing whether or not their subsequent actions were reasonable or not. By the way, this happened in the 11th Federal Circuit. In police shooting cases, the case law can be different depending on which Federal Circuit you're in. I've already researched these facts against 11th Circuit existing case law. We'll get to that in a minute. Officers had looked for the guy earlier in the day unsuccessfully. Then they received another call at around 11:30 a.m. reporting that the man had returned and was continuing to vandalize houses in the area. It's unclear to me whether or not they had identified who this guy was prior to actually encountering him. If so, he did have an extensive criminal history that did indicate that he could be dangerous. If not, then they were just encountering a man who may or may not be the guy who they were looking for. The bodycam footage released a few days ago shows the officer locate the man and then walk towards him.
Is that him?
He notices that the man is holding a hatchet. It's also unclear whether there was information provided beforehand, before this moment, that the guy had a hatchet.
Put the hatchet down! Put the axe down!
He orders the man to drop the hatchet. The man says no. He again orders him to drop the hatchet.
Put the axe down! Put the axe down!
Instead of dropping it, the man raises the hatchet near his head. Then the officer shoots him, firing one shot that killed him.
10:33, shots fired.
Here are the important facts as I see them. The man with the hatchet was not advancing towards the officer. He was not threatening the officer. There appeared to be a good bit of distance between the officer and the man with the hatchet. Very little time elapsed between the officer asking the man or ordering the man to drop the hatchet and then the shot being fired. Seconds, really. Last but not least, just prior to the shot being fired, the man did raise the hatchet up next to his head. But he didn't throw the hatchet, at least not yet. There have been many cases where the subject or the suspect refuses to drop a gun and is shot. There was also a recent one in the 11th Circuit, which is the applicable circuit for Florida, where the homeowner was shot by police while he was investigating a potential prowler outside his home. That prowler ended up being a police officer who shot him from the darkness, basically, without even a warning. And I made a video about that case. That was the Snook case, really tragic circumstance. But here, we don't have a gun, but rather a hatchet. Now, hatchets can be thrown, obviously. Does that mean it's basically a gun? Believe it or not, the 11th Circuit actually does already have a hatchet case. That case is Shaw versus City of Selma, 11th Circuit from 2018. In that case, the court held that an officer can use deadly force against a mentally unstable man who had a hatchet in his hand and was advancing on the officer. The man had not raised a hatchet in that case at the time that he was shot, but the court gave the officer qualified immunity anyways. The court held that a reasonable officer could have concluded that he didn't have to wait until the hatchet was being swung towards him before firing in self-defense. Basically, an officer can use deadly force when he has probable cause to believe that his own life is in peril. But in that case, he was known to have threatened customers at a Church's Chicken just a few days before. He ignored more than 24 orders by the police officer to drop the hatchet. 24. And at the time he was shot, he was advancing on the officer with his hatchet in his hand. He was literally only a few feet away from the police officer who shot him and was close enough at that time to have struck the officer within the next few seconds with the hatchet. In other words, the court concluded that the officer who fired the shot was objectively in imminent peril of death or serious bodily injury at the time the shot was fired. These facts in the Shaw case are a little bit different than we have in the present situation. There's a 2016 case also out of the 11th Circuit that's cited by the court in Shaw that could be important here. The case is the Perez case from 2016. And it says that the mere presence of a gun or other weapon is not by itself enough to warrant the exercise of deadly force and give qualified immunity to a police officer. So where the weapon was located, what type of weapon it was, and what was happening with that weapon are all things that are crucial for the court to determine whether or not firing the shot was justified. Again, we must determine whether the officer's use of deadly force was objectively reasonable. That standard depends on whether the suspect posed a threat of serious physical harm with an emphasis on the level and the immediacy of that threat. So although the presence or absence of a weapon is a factor in the analysis, it's merely one element. The ultimate determination depends on the level of risk presented, evaluating the totality of the circumstances surrounding that weapon. In other words, what kind of weapon it was. In considering that question, the court takes into account the fact that guns are, for example, completely different than knives. They're both weapons, but there's a different level and immediacy of a threat posed. For instance, a person standing 6 feet away from a police officer with a knife may present a very different threat than a person 6 feet away with a gun. Well, here, there can really be no doubt that the suspect here was well more than 6 feet away from the police officer. And it wasn't a knife, but rather a hatchet. And now that we have all these hatchet throwing places all over, do we now assume that a hatchet is more capable of being thrown accurately than a knife? Here's another question. What if the guy does throw the hatchet, and as the hatchet is flying through the air, then the officer shoots? If the guy was armed with a hatchet and he throws it, he then becomes an unarmed suspect, assuming he has only one hatchet. That really wouldn't be any different than a suspect firing a gun and then throwing the gun out of reach. At the end of the day here, the facts as provided by the bodycam footage shows that for this police officer to reasonably believe that his life was in peril, that his life was in danger, we have to assume that given the distance involved and the other facts known, that this suspect could have effectively thrown that hatchet and struck the officer. And that seems to me to be a stretch, literally. We learned this in the old days, where we fought with tomahawks. You don't throw your tomahawk. Why? Because you're unarmed and defenseless at that point. It's a one-shot throw, and most of the weapon is a wooden handle. Some different size examples. I mean, here's a little hatchet, and here's a bigger hatchet. I mean, if you're throwing this, it's almost impossible to actually even stick it into a target unless you've practiced at that distance over and over and over again. I mean, it's just really highly unlikely. Based on that, in my opinion, I think it is a bad shoot. Was there a threat there? Yes. Was the threat sufficiently imminent and dangerous to justify a fatal shooting? No. But it's a close enough case, especially with the Shaw opinion that you have there in the 11th Circuit. I think he does get qualified immunity here, but it's a close enough case. In my opinion, it should be up to a jury to decide. Ask yourself, had one of the local homeowners encountered this guy and did the same exact thing, would he have been prosecuted? Self-defense is self-defense at the end of the day. It requires an immediate threat to be reasonable. I highly doubt that law enforcement would give the same benefit of the doubt to a civilian shooter. Here's another old trial lawyer trick for a closing argument that I think can illustrate well the issues that we have. If we had theoretically the ability to create our own facts, what other facts could we create here that would make this shooting more reasonable? All right, let's list some. Let's say the suspect threatened the officer with a hatchet. Let's say the man advanced on the officer with a hatchet. Let's say there was a closer proximity between the two, such as a few feet between the officer and the suspect, so close that the officer would be in striking distance. Let's say that the officer gave a clear warning that the officer would shoot the guy in the head if he didn't drop the axe, rather than just ordering him to drop the axe. And I could go on. These facts, we can't create them. They're just not present. But then again, there are some scary videos out there showing how quickly a crazy guy with a knife can hurt a bunch of people, even while the cops are shooting at him. Maybe a hatchet could do even worse. But at the end of the day, I think the courts rule that this is a good shoot. There's no chance of criminal charges here. Maybe a civil suit is filed. If so, I give it probably maybe 10% chance likelihood of succeeding. Sorry, I'm not sure I left you any better than I found you, educationally speaking, but here are some takeaways to remember. 1. The mere presence of a weapon does not alone justify deadly force. 2. Not all weapons are treated equally by the courts in reviewing the reasonableness of police shootings. Different weapons have different capabilities, and that will be taken into account. 3. Deadly force cannot be used unless someone's life is in imminent danger. And lastly, number 4, the reasonableness of that belief of imminent danger is an objective one, an objective standard. As always, thanks for subscribing and watching. I have some big things in the works. If you have a video to submit, please use the link in the description. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Also, make sure to subscribe to the email updates on the blog at thecivilrightslawyer.com. Remember, freedom is scary. Deal with it.